Hey, what's up? Liron here. In this video, you're going to learn how to color match any color you see using only 6 colors. Most of it is just 3. We're going to use the magazines here. We're going to use these. We're going to swatch different colors, look at them, and match them perfectly. So let's get to it. So I have these watercolor magazines. These are great because there's a huge variety of colors. So it's funny that this is the first thing I show you, but it'll actually really help us. And then I have these little squigglies that I'm going to use, these viewfinders, to isolate a color, and that's really all there is to it. Now let me zoom in, because the entirety of the magazine doesn't matter. All that matters is this point, and so you see this is a yellowy kind of a thing, this is an olive green, this is a very light, almost paper white, even has a bit of coolness or blue to it. The colors look good on the camera, so I think it shows it well. And you have an orange to red kind of spectrum, a bit of purpley blue. So what we're gonna do is basically run this over the page, find a color, maybe this one, a larger one, and then we'll try and recreate it, okay? And I'm really stealing, quote-unquote, this from Stan Miller, because the way he does it is fantastic, and it's a very simple and straightforward kind of a process. Now I am gonna clean my palette. There we go, it is clean. And I'll be using 3 colors to match everything here. So let me show you the colors, and this can actually be, you can use a variety of colors for this, but I'm gonna be using my primary colors that I use often anyway. So that's gonna be the French Ultramarine. I'm gonna pre-wet some of the cakes here just to reawaken. So, French Ultramarine, then we'll use some Perylin Red, and lastly, a bit of Indian Yellow. So these 3 colors will help us mix everything we see here. So let's get started, and I'm going to be matching this color. And this is kind of an orange, right? So what I'm going to do is start with red, because it does have quite a bit of red in it. And sorry, there is a bit of a shadow. It may be distracting, my apologies. But hopefully you're still able to tell what you're looking at. So I'm going to use my red here. And the way Stan does it, and I really like it too, and I will link down below, is he just puts the color there and asks himself, what's missing? What will I add now? Blue? Definitely not. Yellow? Yes, because I want to make this orange. So you can either put it immediately on here or in the mix. Feels like it needs a little more orange. And you see that's quite close. Maybe a little more of the yellow, and we pretty much got there, right? Maybe the value is a little different, but these are very similar. So now let's move on to something a little more red. Okay, let's take a bit of a red, and now you see it's not the same. So to mix this red, we'll start the same way from our red, and I forgot my paper towel, that's fine. So we'll start with the same red here, and I can use the same kind of space, that's actually fine, and we're gonna put it on paper. And just by doing that, we're pretty close, but you'll notice one thing. This red is more purple and it's more muted, so to get it to purple, we're gonna add a bit of blue, right? So I'll start with a bit. And you see I'm doing this all wet and wet. I'm just pouring the paint into the same space. And this still feels like it could use a bit more blue. So let's do that. And we're getting pretty close. And maybe a bit of yellow too. Let's give it a try and see if we get lost along the way, we can always correct. But it feels like it was orange that turned into a bit more of a muted color. But this is really close now. You see? So that's definitely close enough for me. So now let's switch over to something more bluish kind of. This is fairly dark, and I actually find sometimes the darker colors are easier to mix, believe it or not. So we'll get started with the closest thing, which is blue, right? I think blue will be the closest example in this example. And maybe I'll move this just a bit. So this is way too blue, right? So we need to make it a little more purple. So I'm gonna add a bit more red as before, but this time we're going the other way around. We're starting with the blue, and then we're adding a bit of red. And now what I notice is first it has to be darker, but it also feels a little more muted. So I'm gonna add a bit more blue to darken it up. And maybe it's hard to see the nuance here, but the major difference right now is actually in this feels a little more green and muted. So I'm gonna add a bit of yellow to this mix, very little, and it starts to get us close. Let's add a bit more yellow. And now it's pretty similar, maybe a bit more blue. And now it's really, really close. So that's how you match the colors. Now let's move on to some lighter colors here. Let's use the other magazine. We have a lovely Joseph Zbroevich painting on the front page. And for the lighter colors, it's going to be a bit easier to see what we're doing, right? So we can start with a yellow, and maybe I'll switch over to a smaller squiggle because you can see it, I think, well too, or maybe not. Let's stick with this slightly larger one. Okay, so I'm going to place it, and this is the easiest way of doing it because I'm literally placing it right next to the paint, right? And I will clean up the palette again. So hopefully the cleaning trick worked again. The cleaning video editing trick worked again. And now we're obviously in the yellow realm, right? So let's start with some yellow. Now you can't mix every color this way because some colors are very bright and if you can't produce them even with your primary colors. This is why a lot of people do recommend using lemon yellow or, you know, lemon yellow, cyan, and magenta, because it does sometimes allow you to mix closer colors, more options. So maybe you'll see me using more lemon yellow in the future, who knows. But now this is obviously more orange, so let us add a bit of red. Not a lot. So we are more towards orange land. Now to me it feels maybe even back to some more yellow. But you'll notice one important thing, this feels a little more gray and a little less colorful. And how do we gray an orange? We add a bit of blue to it, because that's the only color we haven't added. So you end up discovering that this color is actually quite muted, and you can even treat it as a bit of a greenish kind of yellow, right? Now maybe the only difference is it's a little light, so I can come back with a kind of dry brush and soak or absorb back, and that is really close. That is super close. I don't think I need to do anything else, right? So you see I'm using only 3 colors, and the more muted the color you're mixing, the easier it's going to be and the more options you'll have for mixing it. When we deal with these, for example, these bright reds, maybe you'll need a different primary color. Let us use the other side of the paper, and you can save quite a lot of materials this way. And now we're dealing with green, so we can actually use the same mix from earlier, but it is way too orange. So what are we gonna add to get it green? We need more blue. Okay? And you can even go wrong, and I love how Stan Miller shows it. It's like, okay, let's say you thought it should have more red. So I'm gonna put the red in here, and now you're like, oh, that's not what I need. That's pretty terrible. That turned it into an orange. So you come back with more yellow right on top of that, like this. And then you're like, okay, what's the next step? I needed blue, right? So let's add a bit of blue to that. So here we go. And now, this feels very blue, so we're missing a bit of green actually. So how will we do that? We'll add more yellow to kind of bring it, make it a little maybe lighter, a little olivey, right? Now it feels like it needs a bit more yellow, because it was closer to the yellow earlier. See? And then let's try adding a bit red, maybe turning it a bit more, see? A bit more muted. And we're really close. So we're good with that. Let's try something light. Okay, so the sky here. And when you look at it in the context of the painting, you're like, oh, the sky is blue, right? But the sky isn't really blue. The sky is more of a light lilac purpley color. So let's do that. So how do we produce a muted or kind of purple? We can actually start with any color we want, but the closest thing is still blue in my opinion. And most people can probably tell it is blue. So let's use blue. And a very light wash, because this is a very pale sky, right? So we add a bit of blue. Now this is much bluer than this, and this feels a little more lilac and purple. So what do? We add a bit of red to it. And you really need a bit. This red is quite dominant. So here we go. Now what did we get here? This feels too blue purpley, and this is more muted. So what do we need to mute this? We have blue, we have red. We're only missing a bit of yellow. So let's put a bit of yellow, kind of mute this out a bit, And look at what we got here. We're starting to get really close. I actually find it's so funny. I find that the skies and light pale blues are the hardest for me to mix sometimes. It's so funny. So if I compare the two, this feels a little more green. So we'll need a bit more red. Maybe even a bit more blue. So you see now we're really, really close. Maybe a bit more red. But now it's fractional, it's not as important. See? And these are very close. Hopefully it comes through the camera. Like they're really, really close. So now let's try something a little different. Let's go for that bright red, okay? So I'll have to use a small squiggly for this one. You'll have to forgive me. Just because otherwise I'll see all the letters and I don't want that. So this is red. Now the purer and darker the color, the more likely you are to maybe not be able to mix it. But luckily for us, I actually think this is quite similar to the Perylene Red. Now one thing you'll notice, if you compare the two, is that the Perylene Red is actually a little brighter. So how will we bring this down a bit? We'll start adding a bit of blue and a bit of yellow to mute it. So let's start with a tiny bit of blue. That's actually really close. We're almost there. Maybe we'll add a bit of yellow, see what happens. Just a bit. We're really close here. This is really close to being the same color. Maybe the value is a little different, but this is actually really close. This is definitely close enough. If you see this in the context of a full painting, this is close enough. And the painting I showed you, or maybe I will show you, I don't remember the scheduling, this one, it's close enough. If you get this, like this color, if you compare it one by one, it's going to be 90%, maybe 80% accurate, but it is close enough. When you look at the overall thing, it will look good. Now, just for fun, we can actually add a bit of a different red. Let's try adding a bit of a Pyrrole Scarlet. Because maybe the red is just different. So if I add a bit of a layer of Pyrrole Scarlet above it, quite pure out of the tube. Now let's do another one next to it. It's actually close. But the Perylene is a little more muted. You see, there is quite a difference. This is much closer than this. Okay, now let's see what else we have here. You can do it for everything, like even a very dark color, but let's just scroll through here. Like this may be a bit hard to mix, because that's a really bright and kind of out there color. Maybe I'll need a French a phthalo blue for that. Let's give it a try and see what happens. Maybe we'll fail, maybe we'll succeed, but let's at least try. I have a feeling this is going to be a bit of a hard one to mix. I think with French ultramarine it's going to be really hard. Let's see what we can achieve though. That's maybe close, right? So I'm going to use a fairly light, and you can already see it's vastly different. Now if I'll add a bit of yellow to it, it's going to be way too green. So this is the kind of color you'll have a hard time mixing. So it's good that we've arrived to one of those. So let me try something different. If it doesn't work with French ultramarine, let's try a different primary. So for example, ideally if you can do this with maybe the double primary palette, so you have a cool and warm of each color, you'll be good. So if I use this manganese blue hue, it may get me closer, right? And then let's use lemon yellow, which I usually hate, instead of Indian yellow. Now we're starting to get a bit of a brighter blue, right? So that's much closer. So this is the kind of paint that would have been really impossible to mix with French ultramarine, which is why I do want you to have maybe at least 2 blues and 2 yellows. For the reds, I find that I can get away with using just a kind of middle of the road red, but for other colors it may be a little harder. Well, let me get rid of this, because I don't want to smear it all over the magazines. Now let's see what else we have inside. Let's flip through it a bit. Look at some nice art while we're at it. And I'm on purpose, I didn't want to match colors from my own paintings, because it's the same colors I'm using. It's going to be way too easy. Ooh, look at this bright red. Let's try matching this bright red. So this is another example for a very bright color that we'll have a hard time matching with Perylene Red, for example. So let's try using Pyrrole Scarlet, which is much brighter. So here we go. There isn't a lot of palette action here, so you're not really missing anything. In this instance, it is important to see the mixing on paper for the most part. So let's just use it straight out of the tube, aka from the well. And right out the gate, it is pretty close, but what do we notice here? It's actually not as bright. So we need to mute this, which is funny because initially I was like, oh, this is going to be a hard one to mix. But not necessarily. In fact, let me try and see what I can achieve here with Parylene. Just see if we can get it to be close enough. So I think it's doable, but let's stick to the Pyrrole Scarlet because it does appear to me closer in hue, meaning the color itself is close. Now let's try and mute it with a very tiny bit of French Ultramarine. And funny enough, surprisingly enough, we're quite close. Let's add a bit more of that blue. So you see, it's not that hard. What's funny here is that it's kind of, it looks very bright, but in the context of the entire scene, I added a bit of yellow. Feels like there was a bit more orange here. In the context of the entire scene, it looked super bright, which means the painter did a really good job. You see? And next to that green, especially, but it's not that bright of a color. So it's funny. Maybe we learned a new lesson here. Let me get another scrap piece of paper and we'll flip through this, find something else that is interesting. And you can really do this for everything. Like for example, let's do it with this. It's very unique color, I think. Very interesting, kind of a lilac-y purple. So this does feel like I could get it with French Ultramarine. So let's stick to our initial attempt. The only difference in this example is I think the French Ultramarine and the Parylene Red may neutralize each other a bit too much. So let's try it first. So you see we get, with these two, a bit of a gray purple. It is close, but we're missing a bit more of that vibrancy and brightness. One thing we can do is add that manganese blue and see what happens from earlier, because that's going to add a bit of it to here. But another thing to have in mind is if we drop the Parylene Red, and we'll actually use a magenta like we should, that's Ruth, if we'll actually use magenta, that I have a bit of here, kind of a Quinacridone Rose, will probably get us closer. So let's try it out. So you see that's a little bit better, but I do feel like we'll have a better success with this magenta together with the manganese blue hue. So let's actually start with the manganese. Then let's add to that bit of that magenta, Quinacridone Rose, PV19, whatever you want to call it. And this is pretty close. And we do need to darken it. Let's add a bit more of that. I'm a bit timid with the water now, with the paint. I should do it more freely. And maybe we need more blue, because this feels bluer. So now you see that's a little closer, right? That feels a little closer. We can even maybe try adding a bit more blue. That's really nice. You know what's funny? I think adding a bit of my Jaune Brilliant opaque color opaque white that I use for highlights would actually help here. So sometimes, I don't know, it's just an instinct, but I knew it would help because this feels a little more milky. So adding white will make it a little more milky. So here we go, we mix that, and you can mix that. You can mix whatever you want here. Let's do this kind of an ochre yellow, right? So we'll start with the yellow, which is the closest. And let's do the swatch a little larger than our small viewfinder. Now it is an orange in a way, so we'll add a bit more red to it. But now we have to mute it, so let's add a bit of French Ultramarine here. Way too much, but let's try and see if we can spread it out. And we're close, we're actually really close. We can use whatever mix I have here. The dark spot is really close, right? So you see this, hopefully this helps with the process of color matching. You can match anything you see here, really. The only thing, again, to have in mind, all of these greens, like look at the variety, and you can even try and test yourself and think, okay, does this have more blue in it? Here. Does this have more blue in it? Does this have a little more yellow in it? And kind of imagine and visualize yourself mixing it and then actually doing it and seeing what happens, right? The only caveat is, as I mentioned, these bright colors. This bright of a red, maybe a bright orange. Bright and artificial colors may be a little harder to mix. So even something like this green, you may need something like a phthalo green to mix it. Maybe, not sure. But everything else you see here, everything beautiful art, like great artists. Pretty much everything here can simply be mixed with 3 primary colors. Have a split primary palette, use both a warm and a cool blue, a warm and a cool red, a warm and a cool yellow, and you got most of your bases covered. So I hope that helps. Now let's wrap it up. So thank you so much for watching. Once again, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed seeing the fantastic artwork in these magazines. And this is great. Something that has a lot of colors, not just a single painting that has a very set color scheme, something that is like a newspaper or stuff like that. Use these nice little squigglies, isolate the color and practice this, and I do believe that if you do this in isolation, it will also improve your ability to match colors when it's in the context of a large painting, which is something that I'm learning to improve because I have a lot of trouble with this. So thank you so much. Don't forget to subscribe, to like, leave a comment, let me know your thoughts, and I will see you again real soon.